Most people wake up on a Monday and tell themselves this week will be different. They will finally start waking up early. They will finally stop reacting badly to small comments from a coworker or partner. They will finally control their temper, their spending, their eating, their scrolling. By Wednesday, the old pattern is back. By Friday, they have stopped noticing it even happened. This is not a failure of willpower. It is the normal outcome of how most people approach change. They wait for motivation instead of building a system. They wait for a feeling instead of making a decision. The Stoics understood something most people never learn. Change is not an event. It is a daily practice, repeated without excitement, long after the initial excitement is gone. If you have felt this cycle, you're not broken. You're simply doing what almost everyone does. The difference between you and someone who actually changes is smaller than you think. And this video will show you exactly where that difference lives. If this video helps you see that difference clearly, hit like and subscribe. It helps this channel keep making practical Stoic content that respects your time and your intelligence. Number 1. People confuse wanting change with choosing it. Wanting something and choosing something are not the same action, yet most people treat them as identical. Wanting is passive. It sits in the mind as a preference, a mood, a wish that things were different. Choosing is active. It requires a decision that gets carried into behavior repeatedly, whether or not the mood cooperates. The Stoics were relentless about this distinction because they understood that the mind will happily generate wants all day long without ever producing a single action. A person can want to be calmer, want to be disciplined, want to be kinder, and feel entirely sincere about it, while never actually choosing the specific behaviors that calmness, discipline, or kindness require. This is not hypocrisy. It is simply how untrained minds operate. Wanting feels like progress because it is emotionally engaging, but it produces nothing on its own. Epictetus taught that the only things truly within our control are our judgments and our choices, not our circumstances and not our feelings. This means that real change never starts with a feeling of readiness. It starts with a choice made regardless of readiness. Most people wait to feel ready before they act differently. And this waiting becomes a permanent holding pattern because the feeling of readiness is unreliable and often never arrives on its own schedule. The person who is waiting to feel motivated to exercise, to feel confident before speaking honestly, to feel calm before responding patiently, will wait indefinitely because feelings follow action far more often than they precede it. Choosing does not require the feeling. It only requires the decision, executed anyway. This is why so many people spend years in the same patterns despite genuinely wanting something different. They are sincere in their wanting. Sincerity is not the missing ingredient. Consistency of choice is. A man can genuinely want to stop losing his temper with his children and still lose it that same evening. Not because his want was fake, but because wanting was never going to do the work that choosing does. The gap between these two mental states is where almost all human stagnation lives. It is invisible because both states use the same language internally. The mind says, "I want to change," and mistakes the sentence for the deed. The Stoic response to this gap is not motivational speech. It is structure. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections not to inspire himself with grand feelings, but to remind himself, morning after morning, of the specific choices in front of him that day. He treated change as a discipline of attention, not a surge of inspiration. This is a crucial detail that modern self-improvement culture often skips. Structure does not care how you feel. It asks only what you did. A person who builds a simple, repeatable structure around a change, however small, will outperform a person who relies on strong feelings of commitment every single time. Because feelings are inconsistent and structure is not. Consider the ordinary example of someone who says they want to read more instead of endlessly scrolling their phone before bed. The wanting is real. They may even feel frustrated with themselves nightly. But choosing looks different. It looks like physically placing the phone in another room and placing the book on the pillow every night, regardless of mood. That is a choice translated into a specific, repeatable action. The person who only wants will scroll again tonight. The person who chooses removes the option before the moment of temptation arrives. This is the entire difference between the two mental states, made visible in a single ordinary evening. The brutal truth here is number 2. Comfort is the real opponent, not time or circumstance. People commonly blame their lack of change on external things. Not enough time, the wrong job, the wrong relationship, the wrong year to start. These explanations feel reasonable because they point outward, away from the self, and this is precisely why they are so popular. The Stoics rejected this outward-pointing habit entirely. Seneca observed that people are not short on time. They waste a great deal of the time they do have, and then blame time itself for their stagnation. The actual opponent to change is rarely circumstance. It is comfort, and comfort is patient, familiar, and extremely well defended inside every person's daily routine. Comfort does not announce itself as an enemy. It disguises itself as reasonable rest, deserved relaxation, or simple practicality. The evening spent watching something forgettable instead of working on the skill you claim to care about feels justified in the moment because the day was long and you deserve a break. This justification is not false exactly. It is incomplete. It ignores that this same justification is available every single day, forever, and that comfort will always have a reasonable sounding argument ready. The Stoics called this pattern the tyranny of the pleasant, where the immediate ease of a choice quietly overrides the long-term value of a harder one, day after day, without ever feeling like a dramatic decision in the moment. What makes comfort especially difficult to fight is that it rarely costs anything visible in the short term. Skipping a difficult conversation today does not blow up your relationship today. Avoiding the harder version of a work task does not get you fired today. Choosing the easy path has no immediate bill attached to it, which is exactly why people keep choosing it. The cost of comfort is deferred, compounding quietly in the background, and by the time it becomes visible in the form of a stalled career, a hollow relationship, or a body that no longer does what it used to, it appears suddenly rather than gradually, even though it was never sudden at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about getting out of bed in the morning, addressing his own resistance to leaving warmth and ease for the work of being a functioning human being. This detail matters because it shows that even a Roman emperor, a man with enormous responsibility and discipline, fought the same basic battle against comfort that an ordinary person fights against their alarm clock. Nobody outgrows this fight. There is no version of maturity or success that removes the pull of comfort. What differs between people is not the presence of this pull, but the seriousness with which they treat their obligation to act despite it. The person who eventually does change is not someone who found a way to make the harder choice feel comfortable. There's someone who stopped requiring comfort as a precondition for action. This is a subtle but important reframe. Most self-improvement advice tries to make the hard thing feel good through motivation, community, gamification, or inspiration. Stoic practice takes a different approach entirely. It trains a person to act appropriately regardless of how the action feels, treating discomfort as simply part of the terrain rather than a signal to stop. The brutal truth is that comfort will never go away, and waiting for a life stage where it disappears is waiting for something that does not exist. There is no future version of your schedule, your job, or your energy levels where the pull toward ease vanishes on its own. What changes is your willingness to act while that pull is still present. This is available right now, in this ordinary day, and it requires no new circumstances at all, only a decision to stop treating comfort as a legitimate veto over the actions that actually matter to you. Number 3, identity resists change more than circumstances do. A quieter reason most people never change is that their sense of who they are has been built around the very patterns they claim to want to break. A person who has spent years describing themselves as someone who is bad with money, someone who always overreacts, or someone who never finishes what they start, has built an identity around that description, whether or not they consciously chose to. This identity feels stable and familiar, and familiarity is comforting even when the thing it describes is painful. Changing the behavior threatens to unravel a self-concept that has been reinforced for years, and this threat is often more powerful than any external obstacle in the way. The Stoics placed enormous emphasis on self-examination precisely because they understood that people often cannot see their own patterns clearly. Epictetus taught that it is not events that disturb people, but the judgments they hold about those events, and this applies directly to self-judgment as well. A person who has judged themselves as fundamentally impatient will interpret every small lapse in patience as confirmation of a fixed trait, rather than as an isolated moment of poor judgment that could be corrected. This judgment becomes self-fulfilling, not because the trait is truly fixed, but because the story about the trait shapes what actions feel possible going forward. This is why simply knowing what to do differently rarely produces change on its own. Information is not the obstacle for most people. Most people already know they should speak up less impulsively, save more money, or exercise more consistently. What stands in the way is a quiet internal narrative that says this is not who I am, and that narrative operates beneath conscious awareness, shaping decisions before the person even registers making a choice. You cannot out-argue a story you have not noticed you are telling yourself. The story simply keeps running the show while the person consciously believes they are trying to change. Marcus Aurelius approached his own flaws with a kind of clinical honesty that avoided both harsh self-condemnation and comfortable self-excuse. He did not write to himself that he was a bad person for his failures, nor did he write that his failures did not matter. He examined them the way a craftsman examines a flawed piece of work, with the specific intention of correcting the process next time. This is a useful model because it separates the person from the pattern. A person is not their impatience. A person is someone who, in specific moments, has practiced impatience and can therefore, in future specific moments, practice something else instead. The practical work here involves noticing the exact language a person uses about themselves and treating that language with suspicion rather than acceptance. When someone says, "I'm just not a disciplined person," this sentence is doing real work in preventing change, because it converts a pattern of past choices into a fixed trait of identity, which then feels immovable. The Stoic reframe replaces this sentence with something more accurate. I have often chosen comfort over discipline, and I am now choosing to practice differently. This is not a cosmetic change in wording. It restores the location of agency to where it actually belongs, in the choices being made now, rather than in a supposed fixed nature that excuses those choices. The brutal truth is that most people will never change because they are, without realizing it, protecting an identity that depends on staying the same. Confronting this requires a kind of honesty that is uncomfortable, because it means admitting that the story you tell about yourself is not a neutral description, but an active force shaping your future. Once you separate your identity from your patterns, you free yourself to treat every day as a fresh set of choices rather than a confirmation of who you have always supposedly been. Number 4, real change requires discomfort without guaranteed reward. One of the least discussed reasons people abandon change is that they expect a clear, visible reward on a predictable schedule, and when that reward does not appear on time, they quietly conclude the effort is not working. Modern life has trained people to expect quick feedback, whether through instant messages, instant search results, or instant entertainment, and this expectation bleeds into personal growth, where the actual timeline for meaningful change is almost always slower and less visible than people are prepared for. The Stoics operated with a completely different relationship to reward. They practiced virtue and discipline as ends in themselves, not because a specific outcome was guaranteed by a specific date. Seneca wrote extensively about the difference between the outcome of an action and the character required to take that action, insisting that a person's task is to act rightly and consistently, while the results belong to forces outside personal control. This is not a comfortable idea in a culture built around measurable progress, key performance indicators, and visible transformation photos. But it is an accurate description of how meaningful change actually works. The person who starts practicing patience with a difficult family member does not receive a visible, measurable improvement in the relationship after 1 week, or possibly even after several months. The change happens beneath the surface, in the accumulation of moments handled slightly better than before, long before any external evidence appears to confirm it. This absence of quick reward is precisely where most people quit. Not because the practice is failing, but because they were never prepared for how invisible early progress actually is. A person beginning to manage their reactions more carefully will still feel irritation, will still occasionally fail, and will not feel like a calmer person after 2 weeks of effort. If their commitment depends on feeling different quickly, they will conclude the practice does not work for them personally and abandon it right before the accumulation would have started producing visible results. The brutal truth is that almost everyone quits during this invisible phase, which is exactly why so few people make it to the visible phase on the other side. The Stoic solution to this problem is to detach the practice from the expectation of reward entirely, and to root commitment instead in the judgment that the action is correct and worth doing regardless of outcome. This is a genuinely difficult mental shift, because it asks a person to keep showing up for something with no promise of confirmation that it is working. Marcus Aurelius approached his daily obligations, including tedious governmental duties he found unpleasant, with the understanding that doing the right action was the entire point, not a means to a satisfying feeling afterward. This orientation removes the dependency on reward that derails most modern attempt to change. There is also a discipline required in tolerating the specific discomfort of not knowing whether the effort is working, which is different from the discomfort of the effort itself. A person can tolerate a hard workout more easily than they can tolerate months of exercising without seeing the results they expected, because the second discomfort involves uncertainty rather than simple physical strain. This uncertainty discomfort is where most abandoned gym memberships, unfinished courses, and quietly dropped New Year's resolutions actually die. Recognizing this in advance and naming it honestly as uncertainty rather than failure allows a person to continue through it rather than mistaking it for evidence that the whole effort was misguided. The practical takeaway is to build a personal standard for what counts as success that does not depend on external results at all. Success becomes simply whether you did the practice today, regardless of how you feel about its results. This is not a lowering of standards. It is the only standard that survives contact with the actual slow, invisible nature of real change. Most people will never change because they require proof along the way that change is happening, and that proof rarely shows up on the schedule they expect. The people who do change are the ones who kept acting correctly without that proof, trusting the process the way the Stoics trusted, right? Number 5. The few who change simply refuse to negotiate with themselves. After examining wanting versus choosing, comfort, identity, and the absence of quick reward, a final and decisive factor separates the people who change from those who do not: the presence or absence of negotiation with oneself in the moment of decision. Most people, even after understanding everything discussed so far, still fail because they allow a brief internal negotiation each time a difficult choice appears. Just this once. I'll start properly tomorrow. It doesn't matter today, specifically. This negotiation feels harmless in each individual instance, but it is the actual mechanism by which almost every failed attempt at change unravels, one small exception at a time. The Stoics were unusually strict about this exact moment, because they recognized that character is built and destroyed in these small negotiations far more than in any single dramatic decision. Epictetus taught his students to treat certain commitments as non-negotiable, precisely because he understood that the human mind is extremely skilled at constructing reasonable-sounding exceptions in the moment of temptation. A person does not decide in one grand moment to abandon their goal of eating well or managing their temper. They decide it in dozens of tiny moments where they grant themselves permission for a single exception, and each exception makes the next one easier to justify until the original commitment has quietly dissolved without ever being formally abandoned. This is why the people who do successfully change often describe their process as feeling almost boring or rigid to outsiders. They are not more motivated than everyone else. They have simply removed the negotiation from the equation entirely, treating certain actions as fixed obligations rather than daily debates. This removes an enormous amount of mental effort, because a decision made once and held as a rule rather than reconsidered every day requires far less willpower than a decision that must be re-won in every single instance. Willpower is a poor long-term strategy precisely because it depends on refighting the same negotiation repeatedly, and negotiations are exhausting in a way that fixed rules are not. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections specifically to reinforce this non-negotiable stance with himself, reminding himself each morning of the kind of person he intended to be that day, before circumstances had a chance to present tempting exceptions. This was not a one-time inspirational exercise. It was a repeated discipline, because he understood that the negotiating voice returns every single day and must be addressed every single day, not defeated once and forgotten. This detail is often missed by people looking for a permanent fix to their motivation. There is no permanent fix. There is only a daily renewal of the same refusal to negotiate, repeated for as long as the change matters. The brutal truth underlying this entire video is now visible in full. Most people will never actually change, not because they lack intelligence, resources, or even sincere desire, but because they continue negotiating with themselves in the exact moments that matter most, while believing that their sincerity alone should count for something. It does not, and the Stoics never pretended otherwise. Virtue, to them, was demonstrated only through action held consistently under pressure, not through good intentions interrupted by convenient exceptions. This is a demanding standard, and it is precisely why so few people meet it. If you're still watching this, you're already different from most people who start videos like this one and drift off before the end. That alone does not guarantee change, but it is a small piece of evidence about the kind of attention you are capable of holding. The task now is simple to state and hard to live. Stop negotiating with yourself in the moments that matter. Hold your commitments as fixed rather than optional, and accept that change will remain invisible for longer than feels fair before it becomes real. This is the entire Stoic answer to why most people never change, and it is available to you the next time a small negotiation quietly presents itself, asking for just one exception today. If this gave you something to actually use, make sure you are subscribed and hit like so more people find this channel. Everything covered in this video points back to the same simple observation. Most people do not fail to change because they lack the intelligence to understand what needs to happen, and they do not fail because life gave them a worse set of circumstances than someone else. They fail because change was never treated as a series of small, repeated, unglamorous choices. It was treated as a feeling to wait for, a comfort to be arranged around, an identity to protect, a reward to be confirmed, and a negotiation to be won just this once. Each of these 5 patterns looks harmless on its own, in any single moment, which is exactly why they are so effective at keeping people exactly where they already are, year after year, despite genuine and repeated intentions to be different. The Stoics never promised an easier path than this. They did not claim that virtue would eventually feel effortless, or that discipline would stop requiring discipline once you got good enough at it. What they offered instead was a clear and honest description of where the actual work lies. It lives in the ordinary evening when comfort presents its reasonable case for the smaller effort. It lives in the private sentence a person tells themselves about who they supposedly are. It lives in the quiet weeks where nothing visible seems to be happening, and in the small, specific moment where an exception asks to be granted just this once before quietly asking again tomorrow. None of this requires a dramatic circumstance. It only requires attention and a willingness to keep choosing correctly without applause. This is also why so few people actually change, and why that fact is not something to feel discouraged by, but something to take seriously. The rarity of real change is not evidence that it is unusually difficult in some mystical sense. It is evidence that most people are unwilling to keep making a boring, unrewarded choice long enough for it to compound into something visible. That unwillingness is common, understandable, and forgivable, but it is still a choice made daily by people who otherwise sincerely want something different for themselves. Recognizing this removes any excuse for waiting on the right mood, the right circumstances, or the right amount of proof before starting. The conditions you are waiting for are not coming, and they were never required in the first place. What remains is simple to describe, even if it is not simple to sustain. Choose the next action in front of you today, not because you feel ready, but because it is correct. Treat comfort as information, not as instruction. Stop letting old descriptions of yourself decide what you are capable of doing next. Continue the practice through the long stretch where nothing seems to be changing, because that stretch is where the actual change is quietly taking place. And when the moment comes to negotiate an exception, refuse it calmly and without drama, the same way you will need to refuse it again tomorrow. This is not a formula for instant results. It is simply what has always separated the people who change from the people who only ever intended to. The choice, as it always has been, is yours to make today.